Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and with me is my good friend, Debbie Romero, certified Alexander technique instructor. So today's topic is kind of a continuation for the rider. We're calling this one Shoulders Back, because that's what we hear over and over and over and over for so many years. So we're going to talk about shoulders back, how that's typically interpreted, how that really works against the female rider for stabilizing the seat. And then Deb, you have like endless things to talk about if it comes to shoulder use, shoulder pain, and even down the arms, how we use our shoulders is going to directly affect our rein contact.
Yes.
So why don't you like shoulders back? What's the first thing that either comes to your mind?
Well, just smack me and interrupt me if I get off on a tangent when we talk about arms and shoulders. It's just a nightmare to me. But shoulders back, when I was a kid, and I see this a lot in women especially, they tend to move their rib cage back or their rib cage forward and arch their low back. And as when somebody says to put their shoulders back, because that is a habit that, and we do it off the horse too, that we actually, instead of just moving our arm and the top bone in the socket, we tend to stabilize that shoulder joint and move our body to move our arm.
Oh, so sort of bending through the spine rather than actually using the ball and socket joint of the shoulder. And I don't know why, like I did a survey for about a year where I would ask riders to point to their shoulder joint.
Oh my gosh.
And it was just kind of like the hip joint. And I was guilty of this myself. As many times as I've looked at anatomy pictures, there was something in my brain that if you asked me to point to my shoulder joint, I would point to the top side of my arm.
Okay.
Right. So I would sort of point to the very most left or right side of my upper arm.
I think we tend to do that with our hips too, right? We're more externally thinking about it than
like I thought of my shoulder joint at the top of my arm on the side of my body.
Yeah.
And that was not uncommon. Like when I kind of did this informal survey with a bunch of riders, people would point to the front at the top of their arms, or they would point to the sides at the top of their arms. So can you talk about anatomically what that shoulder joint is and where it is on our body?
Well, you can kind of compare it to the hip, and the shoulder joints are the same. The hip joint just bears weight. The shoulder joint doesn't in the human. So,
and how are they the same?
They're ball and socket joints.
Okay.
They have a pretty good range of motion.
That's what the ball and socket joint gives you.
Right.
Is a huge range of motion.
Right. The only thing is we are not quadrupeds anymore. So we use our arms differently. And one Alexander teacher said this, and I can't think of who it was, but our arms are there just to get our hands where they need to be.
Oh, interesting.
I thought that was a great quote. I'll have to figure out who it was. I'm thinking I can't think if it was Gorman or Jeremy Chance said that. But so really your arm is directing your hand.
So where is the ball and socket joint? Where is it located that you could describe verbally, of course, but where, because it surprised me. Like, I don't know why it surprised me other than when we look at anatomy pictures, you're looking at it in 2 dimensions.
I think that's the big thing. And when I used to teach anatomy, that is the hardest thing, is taking something that is written linearly and making it 3D.
Right.
So
Looking
I
at a
was I was
flat
always
picture.
trying to do it on the skeleton and make use crate paper and stuff to do fascial lines. But I think I would like to describe it so people have better use is that your arm is on your back.
Yeah.
It's not on the front of your body. If you think about where your shoulder blade is, that's on your back.
Well, in that, it was like, I don't know why, because I knew it intellectually, but it was kind of the experience of having this sudden realization that the socket part of the ball and socket is in the scapula. And I
Right.
was like, oh, it's not like a different bone than my scapula. It
Good
it's
point.
it's in the scapula. So the socket is in the scapula, which continues down the back. And and so the ball at the top of the arm bone fits into the socket on the back. Exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so it totally changed my concept of having a little ball and socket stuck to each side. It was like, oh no, it's the socket is the scapula.
Right. And if you ever look at Thomas Meyer's work, he's the big guru on fascia. He talks about something called brachiation, which is the marsupials actually swing through the trees, grabbing first with their pinky. And
Mm.
that's the fascial connection of the arm to the back. It goes all the way from the pinky, behind the elbow, down the back of the scapula, and it actually attaches at your sacrum. So
Oh,
you're
wow, through the fascial connection.
through the fascial lines. So, and you can see when marsupials swing through the trees, their whole body swings like a dancer.
Mm-hmm.
So you can play a game, people can play a game, grabbing with your pinky as opposed to grabbing with your thumb. When you grab with your thumb, you contract your forearm, your bicep, and your chest, and you tend to roll your shoulders forward.
Right. So rounded shoulders are literally a little bit of a subluxation of the ball coming out of the scapula. And so shoulders back can almost be a reverse, like jamming the ball into the socket. Like
Well,
where
it
when
usually
the
when
rib
somebody,
cage comes
yeah,
forward, like what
that's
you're
that's what I
talking
would say.
about.
It's usually a dysfunction when those words are used. So I think it's helpful to let people know that your arms are on your back. They are not on your front. And because of all of the thumb things we're doing these days with
Yeah.
devices, that doesn't help us with our rein contact whatsoever. But to really feel that connection is through your pinky and not through your thumb.
Yeah, and I'll use that because you've talked about that a lot, and you've used
Mhm.
that with riders regarding rein contact and rein
Yes.
use. And it really is just a thought. It's
Yes.
more of a thought than an action. It doesn't mean that you're suddenly hooking your pinkies around the reins and riding with just your pinkies. But when we don't think about it, if we don't bring conscious awareness to it, we tend to be thumb oriented. Like the opposable thumb is one of the greatest human benefits, right? That's
Right.
what makes us so dexterous. But we tend to overuse our thumbs, where you're saying the more efficient use of the arm is to just include the pinkies, which is more mental. Like when I work with a rider, your thumbs are still on top, your wrists are still straight. You
Mhm.
still put the rein through the ring finger and the pinky. But the thought of sort of operating pinky first, which takes a little bit of concentration,
Mhm.
it does actually help people become more stable through their whole back in their seat
Yeah, and if
with the
you
rein
can look up
contact.
brachiation online, you can actually. It depends upon if you see Thomas Meyer's anatomical picture. I mean, he even because these are fascial sheets that are connecting, which fascia, well, that's a whole nother subject, connects everything together. It's it's very all over the body, but that is the true connection of the arm to the back.
Yeah. Yes. And even if we take our arm and sort of roll it in a circle, if we put our arm and we just make a big circular motion, you can start to feel where that ball and socket joint is. You can start to kind of go, oh, that's where it belongs, back there.
Yeah.
And so shoulders back is a little bit carried over from like a military stance when we talk
Yeah.
about it with riding, which is where most riding instruction sort of came from, was
Right.
military training. And so shoulders back, what I find fascinating is for the male skeleton, because of the shape of men's lumbar and pelvis, when they push the thoracic spine forward, when they push the chest forward, the shoulders do go back where they belong, but they don't arch the lumbar, right?
Exactly. Hmm.
For women, when we do that, if our sternum lifts up, our rib cage comes forward, we push our shoulders back, and you can't control the lumbar spine.
Well, it's that same thing about if you're contracting all of those muscles in a level of tension, there's no communication going on, and that really affects the diaphragm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so shoulders back, which was developed for male military riders, isn't the worst instruction.
No.
Because it doesn't arch the male lumbar and it doesn't tip the male pelvis. So when men open the chest and thrust the shoulders back, it can have a stabilizing effect on the seat, on the low back
Yes.
and the seat. When women do the exact same movement, it has the opposite effect because we have very different shaped lumbars and very different shaped pelvises. And I think we have, I can't remember what the ratio was, we have maybe 20% more connective tissue,
Hmm.
which is what allows us to have babies, right?
Right.
We're more flexible in that area. And so for women, it's one of the worst instructions because it works against stabilizing the female seat on a
Right. It's a
horse.
total disconnect. It's kind of
Hmm.
like the model walking,
Yeah, that excessive curve of
that
the low
excessive
back.
curve, or a gymnast.
It's even, well, gymnasts, it's a little different, but with riders, we're receiving all the force of motion up through our seat and into our back. And so when women receive the instruction, shoulders back, we all sort of throw our shoulders back, pushing our rib cage forward and arching the low back,
Hmm.
which is going to tilt the pelvis off of the seat bones as well.
Right.
And so women struggle more with finding their power in their seat, with finding stability in the seat. And so it will hold a lot of female riders back from higher levels of riding because that instruction, shoulders back, is working directly counterproductive to the stability of the low back and the seat for the female rider.
Yes.
And so one of the first things I ask people to do, female riders, is I go, just start with a slump. And
Right.
oh, the looks I get. It's like, because the shoulders back for women is really just kind of a rolling of the ball into the scapula, the
Yeah.
socket in the scapula. It's just a gentle release that's sort of back and down. And that's the only way we can do it without arching the lumbar.
Yeah. The back and down, or yeah, yeah, it gets very complicated.
Yeah. So for female riders, if you take a deep breath and sort of let the sternum drop, the shoulders will be straight, but there's about, I don't know, there's just massively less tension involved and a lot less muscle use. So it almost feels slumpy, especially for people who have been riding under the instruction, shoulders back, shoulders back, shoulders back. All of a sudden, when their shoulders are actually, the ball is in the socket, which gives the appearance of straightness through the shoulders, but there's a softness to it.
Yeah,
And
that brings up a thought about the whole, when somebody gives the instructions of shoulders back, we immediately go into some level of tension. or holding,
We
which is
go to use
extra
the
effort
muscles.
anyway.
Yes, we go to use the muscles first and foremost.
Right. Instead of thinking skeletally, where is that? Where should my shoulders be just in daily activities?
Yeah. And ironically, if I take shoulders back completely out of my vocabulary as a riding instructor, all of the female riders I work with, we just shift the focus to stabilizing the lumbar and the pelvis, and the shoulders always land perfectly, which
Yeah.
changes the arm use entirely and changes the rein contact and rein aids completely. So I don't even talk about shoulders other than to say maybe slump a little bit, because when women slump and let the shoulders round forward, that actually helps us access the muscle coordination we need to stabilize the lumbar.
Right. It
And then,
allows the release of the tension up top. It's just getting to a better coordination overall.
yes, yes. And I go, once women figure out the coordination of stabilizing the core, so you're using your core muscles to stabilize the lumbar spine and the pelvis, so you're balancing on the seat bones, that's the harder part.
Mm-hmm.
And if the focus is there, I find the shoulders take care of themselves.
Right.
And the hands get quieter and softer. You can feel the horse through the reins more, and you can give better rein aids because there's not that jerkiness of
Well,
tension.
yeah, and a lot of people try to balance off their hands too because of the relationship to the lumbar. They've got
Well,
to
and
stay.
that's just it. That's
Yeah.
just it. If we're working hard to do shoulders back, heels down, all of our effort for stabilizing is up in the shoulders and arms or down in the feet. And so what happens is if we stabilize at the top and the bottom of the body, the middle can't stabilize.
Yep. And that's where all the motion comes in.
And that's where all the
That's the
motion
move
comes
with the
in.
horse thing.
Right. So if we really want a professional level seat, or we want a quiet seat, or a stable seat, or a good seat, or we want a better riding posture, it all starts for women with controlling the stability and the straightness of the lumbar spine and the pelvis. And
Mm-hmm.
then actually, the shoulders are actually easier for women because we don't have as much upper body strength inherently. And it's a huge relief. It's a huge relief to not have to think about using your shoulders and arms, but to find all your power where we
Right.
have the most power,
Right.
right? Which is in our lower body rather than our upper body. And
Yeah.
it's funny because I'll also hear people talk about it may be a whole different podcast topic, but I will have people tell me, female riders, that their big, muscly, powerful horse is really a man's horse.
Wow.
I know. Have you ever heard that?
No, I
Women will
haven't.
tell me that different
My circles are
instructors,
smaller
have-
than yours.
yeah, that it's a man's horse. And I go, what do you mean it's a man's horse? And what I quickly find out is that that horse is balancing on the reins. And so
Oh
you
gosh.
need a lot of upper body strength to ride that horse. And some women are like, I got to go to
Wow.
the gym. I got to develop more upper body strength because I can't ride my horse. He's a man's horse. He's too strong. He's too big. He's too powerful. And I go, no, no, no. Same rules apply. If the horse is shoulders back, which basically means all of their body weight is on their front legs or they're holding through the neck, that horse weighs a ton on the reins.
Yes.
But if the horse, again, just like the women, if you're stabilizing the lumbar and the pelvis, they don't have all that force in the reins. It's just gone. You
Right.
don't need the strength on the reins. So I go, there's no such thing as a man's horse. Every horse who carries himself is light. I
Hmm.
go, and they're so sensitive. It's like watching little tiny kids ride horses always amazes me. You know, because the little tiny child who can barely reach the stirrups can still
They
manage.
balance up there and they're like, here we go.
Yeah. And the horse listens to them.
Like, oh, over there, fine, let's go.
Yeah. Yeah. And to think that we need that much upper body strength with any horse is just crazy.
I think that goes with that whole driving seat thing too. So
It could be because the
mhm.
the tighter you are in your upper body, the more you're working to thrust shoulders back, the less stable your seat becomes, which then perpetuates the tightness in the upper body
Yes.
because our body knows we're unstable, even if our brain doesn't.
Right.
So if we're not stable in our axial skeleton or in our core, then we have to stabilize on the stirrups. We have to stabilize on the reins, or we have to use the saddle for stability because we don't carry it ourselves. Excuse me.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to we did this podcast and we've talked about it several times about the axial skeleton and the pelvis, that mostly everything will do what it needs to do if you have that integrity of the spine and the pelvis organized.
Yes, if
Then the arms and legs are available to do
yes.
what they need to do.
Yeah,
So
because the other point is, and I know we've talked about jockeys before. So a horse galloping is sort of in this huge lengthening and shortening between nose and tail during the gallop. There's a huge stretch from nose to tail, sort of front to back, and then they kind of shrink back together like an accordion within the gallop gait. And so jockeys, their arms are moving almost to full extension,
yes,
full flexion, full extension, like a huge range of motion through the arms. And that's what our arms are meant to do. So if we're thrusting our shoulders back and locking that ball and socket joint, there's no way we can move and maintain a rein contact with a stretching, moving, adjustable head and neck on the horse,
yes,
right? So the joints are supposed to be our shock absorbers. And if we're locking our shoulders in place, if we're locking that ball in the socket, thrusting the shoulders back, then there's no more shock absorption action.
no, there's no room. There's no space left in the joint if you've contracted all of the soft tissue around it.
Yeah, and there's
There's
no
there's
mobility,
no mobility left in the whole arm.
right?
I mean, it's going to go right down to the hand too.
And that is the challenge of a good rein contact
Mhm.
is the horse who anatomically the horse's front legs are the equivalent to the human arms and the horse's hind legs are the equivalent to human legs. So what we call their knee on the front legs is technically the carpus, which is the wrist, right? It's not really a knee, it's a wrist, but we call it the knee all the time. So for a horse to be weight bearing on their arms also restricts the range of motion,
Yes.
the mobility, the shock absorption effect, right? So if horses or any quadruped, if being on their arms is part of their regular stabilization, then how do they adjust for changes in balance? So
They
like if you
can't.
think, well, they can. So what do you think they use? The
I don't
neck and
know.
head, the neck and head.
Okay.
And so I will tell people like when a horse gains and loses balance through their torso and their legs, when humans lose their balance through their feet or their torso, if you think of like a tightrope walker,
Mm-hmm.
the first thing we do on a balance beam is we put our arms out to the side.
Right.
Right. So we have this little short neck and this big head. We don't use our head as a balancing mechanism. We use our arms because our arms are not necessary for weight bearing. So we can use them as a sort of counterbalance. So when we need to balance on one leg, we put our arms out to help us stabilize, right? Horses can't do that because they walk on their arms. So what they do in order to find stability or rebalance or recover balance is they have to adapt the movement of their head and neck. So the head and neck going up, down, in, out, side to side is how they kind of stabilize their middle and maybe their pelvis, their hind end and their middle, their trunk. And when we restrict, if our rein contact turns into a rein aid, constant rein aid, and we lock our shoulders, we've not only made ourselves less stable, but we've taken away the horse's natural mechanism for recovering balance.
I think that's a good point you made, because when somebody instructs us to put our shoulders back, I mean, I can see it in even pictures of riders. That's an aid. That is
Yeah.
not contact. That is a bringing back.
It's a pulling force.
It's a pulling force. It's not contact at all.
Right.
And you just
Because
shared
technically,
how that affects the horse. It's huge.
it's huge. And so to, put on a tie down, a martingale, shorten the reins, get more leverage bits, and think that we have to frame a horse up beginning with restriction of the head and neck. I go, then the only thing the horse can do is shift side to side. And our next problem is, which we'll do a different podcast on, dropping the shoulders, escaping through the shoulders, bulging the shoulders. Because if they don't have a freedom to adjust through the use of their head and neck, then they can't stabilize.
No, they can't.
Yeah.
That's when you see these horses, and correct me if I'm wrong, they've got it. It's so disproportionate. There's massive front end and shoulders. And then everything gets smaller as it goes
Towards the back. Yeah.
I'm like, that's just not right.
No, the muscle development on the horse tells you the most habitual skeletal coordination.
Yeah.
So it's the movement and the use of the skeleton that muscles develop around. And so you can look at a horse's body and know how they're using their body just through which muscles are more developed, which muscles are less developed.
Yeah.
That will tell you a lot.
But I think that's real important that people realize that shoulders back is number one, tensing and locking, and it's an aid. It's a negative pulling.
Yes, that horses can actually lean on.
Oh,
so
yes.
Instead of finding self-carriage through the stability of their back and hindquarter, they're finding stability through the rider's reins, hands, arms, whatever. And they're just leaning and they're basically falling forward and being held up with a backwards force.
And is that the man's horse?
That's how every horse I've ever been on that got called a man's horse does that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes. And that's even with leveraged bits. It's like the horse can learn if they lack stability where it should be, which is in the back and the hindquarters, they will find stability, because that's why we struggle with dysfunction, is if the body isn't stable where it's more mechanically advantageous to stabilize, then the body will find stability, whether it's a horse or a rider. And so what becomes available to a horse if the neck is restricted and they can't use it like we would use our arms to recover from a little misstep or an imbalance, then they're going to tripod onto the bit and the front legs. And that's where the stability of their body is primarily held. So then you get big overdeveloped front ends,
right?
Kind of contorted neck positions and not a lot of strength in the hindquarter. The muscles will atrophy in the back and the hindquarter if they're not being used for the job they're intended to be used for. So every horse I've been on that was called a man's horse, oh my God, they're just, and actually my personal horse was sort of in that category when I first took him, one of my personal horses, and I refused to hold him up with the reins, right? So I just said, no, I'm not going to give you that much rein resistant. And the first couple rides, especially when we went into trot, I thought he was going to somersault.
that would
Like
just, I'm sorry, I'd be in total fear mode with that. I feel like the horse was just I was gonna be meat
which
that the horse
he
fell on.
easily could have done. So I had to
Right.
like use the reins, which he wanted to lean on. But every time I gave him rein pressure, I said, that's got to connect to your feet. If I
Ah,
have to use this much rein pressure, we're coming all the way to halt, and then we're going to try it again. But I am not going to let you go forward. Number one, I don't have the physical strength to hold
right.
you up. Right. And so I'm not doing it that way. And that's one of actually, I find it's an advantage to female riders to not have the upper body strength.
Yeah.
We have to, we have to develop self-carriage in the horse because we run out of upper body strength. We can't ride a man's horse, right? It's exhausting. And a lot of women do. They go to the gym and they build up their upper body strength thinking that's what they need to do. And I go, that doesn't help the rider or the horse. And when I work with male riders, I have one particular male rider in my mind that I've worked with for years. And he's a big guy, really strong. And oh, by the way, does bodybuilding, right? So super strong, very muscly. And that was actually really difficult for him
I bet.
to not use his upper body strength.
I bet
I think for
because
men,
that's so habitual for him.
and I think if you have that much upper body strength, you don't even realize that you're using it.
No.
And so some of our lessons involved, imagine you have the arms of a 10-year-old girl. Like
Oh
just
my.
don't use them, right?
Oh my.
Just you need the arms of a 10-year-old girl, not this big, buff, strong guy, because it wasn't helping. He was actually creating problems through the
Mm,
reins that was working against his horse's development. It was working against his horse's self-carriage. And he really didn't know how much force he was applying,
wow.
right? And that was a learned skill for him
Right.
to really wean off of using that upper body strength. So I'm really sympathetic with male riders that it's difficult to shift into your core strength and not use the upper body strength that you have that just comes naturally.
I think there's a whole other misconception too, that we have to use so much effort, that it has to be a force to reckon with, shall we say, that it has to be that
Yes.
intenseness of it all, especially with arms and legs. When,
No, and in horses that are heavy, horses that are hard to stop, horses that are hard to slow down, there are so many training strategies to work around having to use rein pressure.
good point.
There are hundreds of options other than shortening the reins, pulling on the reins, holding the horse up. There are a billion training strategies to develop the horse's self-carriage with very little use of rein pressure. And so I
Yeah.
go, it's just not necessary. And a lot of horses have this fear of the bit, fear of the reins,
Ah,
or, they just start to get more and more anxious or more and more fearful because of either the discomfort in the mouth, or even if they're not expressing discomfort through the mouth, like a tongue, a busy mouth, a lot of chomping, grinding teeth, they still aren't developing the strength in the body where they need it to feel safe and secure.
yeah. And I'm just getting this flashback of watching old cowboy movies of pull to stop and kick to go.
I know. That's our concept of riding. That's where we all
I
start.
bet, I mean, I think
Yeah.
that is so ingrained everywhere, in movies, and, so we're coming from a completely different direction of
Yeah.
riding, than
Yes.
what people are used to.
Yes. And the first riding lesson everybody has is rarely about the rider's balance and stability, The first
No.
riding lesson is shoulders back, heels down, hold your hand still. Now, pull the right rein, pull the left rein, kick to go, pull to stop. And it's like, it's all about directing the horse. And that's so that we feel safe.
Well, it
You know,
also,
once we can kind of manage forward, halt, left, and right, it helps the rider feel safe. So a lot of people put that as the very first lesson.
I think it's also back in we think, this might come out, we think we need to be in control or we need to be doing something. From an Alexander perspective, you know, do we really need all of this big movement with our arms and legs to accomplish what we need to accomplish?
Right. And beautiful upper level riders, professional riders, there's no excess motion.
Exactly.
It's the same as watching a beautiful dancer. You
Yes.
know, if you're watching somebody who's learning to dance, it always makes people laugh because there's all this jerky kind of excessive motion while we're learning, right?
Yes.
And as if you look at a professional dancer, there's just no wasted effort. Or
And I
even
think, yeah,
even like a beautiful athlete, a really good football player or basketball player, there's that sort of efficiency of motion.
yeah, and we've talked about that before. And you sometimes, even with a horse, you look at them and you say, wow, that horse or that person is so well organized or whatever. The fluidity is there.
Yes.
And you
And
can't really put your finger on anything because that's how organized and fluid they are.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if we circle back to shoulders back, I go especially for female riders. Ladies, if I could tell you one thing, quit thrusting your shoulders back. You will never have a stable seat and you will never feel legitimately secure. Like more
Good
women
point.
tend to have fear issues than men, and it really ties in physically to the stability or lack of stability in our core, in our lumbar, our core, and our pelvis, where men are inherently structurally more stable. Like the skeleton is just inherently more stable than the female skeleton in the lumbar and pelvis. And so women, especially given male riding instruction, tend to be more fearful because they're also less stable in the
Yeah.
lumbar and the pelvis. I
And
go,
I
that
think
goes
from a
hand in
woman's
hand.
point of view, you're really kind of taught, oh, just power through that.
Right, right. And so a lot of women end up shortening their stirrups a lot, clamping with the legs because that's
Mhm.
where we have power, or we can't ever really let go of the reins. Like there's kind of a gripping of the reins for stability or too much use of
Exactly.
the rein, right? And that, again, if our middle is unstable and we've locked our shoulders, we no longer have that joint mobility to deal with changes in the reins, changes of force that are coming from the horse. And we don't have our inherent stability on the back of the horse.
Yeah, it's proven, you know, biologically that if you're contracting that muscle, you shut down all the proprioceptors. So if you're tensing at all, you know, you've kind of, you're working much harder than you need to.
Yeah. And so this has mostly been about riders and improving your riding by just ignore. If you ever hear an instructor as a female rider, for men, listen to it, do it, it'll work for you. For women, when you hear shoulders back in your mind, you're going la 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 la. Take it down to my lumbar. La 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 la. And then they'll say yes, like that. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about, because I know this is a huge issue in the work you do with medical massage and Alexander technique, is shoulder pain, shoulder dysfunction in people.
Mm.
How common is it? When I had a shoulder injury, it was the most pain I have been in.
What
And
did I
it's
tell
hard to
you? I said, give
sleep.
it 15 to 18 months, didn't I?
Oh my God.
And you
Yes.
didn't believe me.
I was like, no.
No, tell me it's not so.
Yeah. Yep. 15
And
to
the older
18
we get, the
months.
longer it takes. Well,
So what would you say, like when you see people with shoulder issues, is there a pattern to what people are doing? And does it relate to that whole idea? Because even when we're told to sit up straight in school or by our mothers or stand up straight, everybody has a tendency to go to that military posture and sort of thrust the shoulders back. So what do you see in your work? Is that related to shoulder pain?
oh yeah, because the way we use ourselves, either we've said this before, either even with the horse, it either affects the horse positively or negatively. It's just that simple.
So you mean we're doing it to ourselves?
Right. It's our behavioral and physical patterns that we use. And the most common one is reaching and grabbing with the thumb first.
And
Or
how does that affect the shoulder?
so it's going to pull everything forward and round the shoulder. And the pec muscle is much bigger and stronger than the muscles that support the back. So the pec muscle is perfectly happy to pull and round your shoulders and bring them forward to accomplish your work. Whereas if you're
So when the pectoral, like if we're grabbing with our thumb and you're contracting across the chest, the upper chest, that's where the pectoral muscle is, which is pulling the ball slightly out of the socket.
it's
Technically
pulling the
called
shoulder
like,
blade up and over the back and forward.
which is technically a subluxation.
Can be.
That it's a slight
A true
dislocation.
subluxation is, in the joint, but
Mhm.
soft tissue wise, you're really getting into an imbalance. And it also kind of, I think of the guy in the gym, it kind of feeds ego because we're such a frontal society. We're always looking at ourselves. The bodybuilder's always looking at his chest. Who's looking at their back? Who's strengthening their back muscles?
Real bodybuilders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I'm in the gym, because I used to be a bodybuilder, but
Mhm.
I'm looking at a guy from head to toe or a person from head to toe. How balanced are they?
Mm. Yes.
There's nothing like seeing this huge guy with this huge upper body and these little stick legs.
Ah,
But going back to the shoulder, it's that leading with the thumb, or as an Alexander teacher, it's not taking time to set yourself up for success, no matter what the stimulus is. We're
so
just
it's kind of just doing it unconsciously,
Mhm.
habitually, instinctually, not being aware of how you're reaching
Exactly.
for something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just
And
taking that thought of um my pinky is, connected all the way to my sacrum. And I always tell women, especially, that's where your power is.
yes. Yes, we have
That's where the
incredible
power
power
is.
in
And
our core. Hmm.
yeah, and I send that if I'm picking up 5-gallon buckets or I'm picking up a bale of hay. I don't pick it up with my arms. The arms are just levers, joints to
Mm.
leverage. Instead of thinking of that as where your strength is, if you think of from the pinky all the way to the sacrum and send all of that down into your core and into your legs, things just aren't as heavy.
Yeah, and you helped me with that a ton because at my farm, I am forever shoveling. I am moving sand or I'm moving compost or I'm cleaning stalls or I'm holding wheelbarrows or I'm shoveling in and out of my gator
Yep.
because between gardening and horses, there's a lot of heavy stuff to move.
Yes.
And especially with shoveling, that twisting motion, right? Or weeding the garden, squatting and weeding. That was really could wreak havoc. And so really
Yes.
learning to stay in the same skills I learned on the back of a horse, really,
Right.
right? Engage the core muscles, straighten the lumbar, balance the pelvis, and use the arms, like you said, as levers.
They're just levers. They're
So if
not
I'm,
they're not the powerhouse.
and the older I get, when I pick up a 50-pound bag of grain, I'm starting to pick it up with a hug rather than trying to pick it
Yeah.
up and hold it out in front of me.
That's what I do these days.
Yeah, I pick it up and hug it and carry it that way because that allows me to just wrap my arms around it, but not carry the weight of it in my arms.
That's a good way to put it. Not wrap my arms around it, but not, my arms are not bearing
The
the
weight.
brunt of it. I send all of that into my back, into my body, because there's much more power down in the pelvis than there is in our arms, especially women.
Oh, yeah. And even like carrying 2 5-gallon water buckets.
Mhm.
I don't know what that weighs, but it's a lot.
I don't want to, I don't want to know.
I don't know what water is per pound. I'll have to look
I
that up.
used to know that, but
But it's like I go, that's my weightlifting workout, right?
yeah.
Just doing the feed movement around, moving hay,
Yeah.
carrying full water buckets,
That's what
shoveling. It's like farm fit instead of
That's what
CrossFit.
farm fitness. We should do a whole nother podcast on that, because I'm doing bicep curls and triceps
know.
and rhomboids when I'm carrying. Everybody goes, "What gym do you go to?" I say,
Yeah.
"It's the farm gym."
Yeah. And now I find, thanks to your help, like when I have to shovel a whole gator, my little John Deere gator, a whole load of compost and go move it into the garden, it's like I can do 8
Mhm.
loads. I go without being in pain, without having to go in and take Tylenol, because I'm really thinking of every shovelful is coming from my lower body, not my arms.
That's a really good point to
Yeah.
to land on, because that it's not an upper body movement. Those are just the levers to, like I said, it's the arms just direct the hands to do whatever. And we've got all these joints. We forgot we have elbows, we have wrists. It's not
Or
just,
using the mobility, because as soon as your
yeah,
arms are weight bearing, that's another joint mobility restriction.
yes,
So to keep the arms less weight bearing and have the weight bearing in the lower half of the body, I had the mobility through my shoulder joint to throw that shovel,
I think
right?
that's a
With
really good point. Yeah, because even mucking stalls, I am not using my shoulders. It's
right.
just a fluid movement from my core to get the poo in the right place.
Yes. Yes. No, and even the shovel, it's like every time I remind myself just to think about my pinkies being involved.
Mhm.
It really does help you find the weight bearing and the strength in the lower half of the body
Yeah,
and not overuse the arms.
yeah. And you'll find you'll have much better stability. You won't get as tired.
Yeah, exactly. You can do more with less pain.
Exactly.
That's the benefit. And when we're riding, the horses get quieter, the more our seat is stable and the better our rein contact is. A rein contact should be a forward direction of force through our arms. And if we
Yes.
do shoulders back, we change that direction of force. So as soon as we
Yes.
thrust our shoulders back, we're pulling, even on a loose rein.
Mhm.
So we can have the rein contact should be a forward direction of force towards the horse's mouth. And you can't do that if your shoulders aren't mobile and your
Exactly.
elbows aren't mobile. Yeah. All right. So we'll wrap it up there. Anything else you want to add?
Pinkies first.
Pinkies first. Yes. Yes. Avoid shoulder pain and be able to do more.
Exactly.
All right, you guys, thank you for joining us once again for the Horse Geeks podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, pass it around if you like the information. We love that you share it. And comment if you have
Yes.
questions or any kind of topic you'd like to hear discussed. We are always happy for comments and questions. Thanks, guys. Till
Bye.
next time.